The first time the cable went slack, my hands were already shaking from exhaustion, not fear, and that's what still bothers me. I remember staring at the tension gauge, waiting for the number to settle, while the sea below the rig looked darker than it should have at that hour. No one had warned me that night shifts came with rules, only that breaking them got people reassigned or sent home quietly. It wasn't until the slack turned into resistance that I understood there were 11 strange rules meant to keep us alive, and I had already ignored one without knowing it. I still don't know who noticed first, me or whatever was waiting below. I remember the first time it happened, standing in the cramped crane cab while the waves slapped against the rig legs, my knuckles white as I gripped the controls. I had barely been entrusted with the heavier lifts when I noticed the cable's tension dropping without warning, and my chest tightened as the gauge wavered like a heartbeat. I couldn't read. Rule 1. If the load goes silent before it reaches the surface, you do not try to correct the tension manually had been mentioned briefly in the safety briefing. But in the moment it felt like a distant suggestion rather than an order. The shadows beneath the load seemed to stretch and twist with the swell, and the silence was almost tactile, pressing against my ears and throat like a wet cloth. My mind raced, calculating weight, torque, and the impossible resistance I felt tugging back through the metal, but every instinct screamed that moving too soon could be catastrophic. I hesitated, wondering if the gauge was broken, or if my inexperience was making the readings unreliable. And then I felt the first shiver of dread that would haunt me throughout the shift. No one spoke, though the comms were live, because everyone on the rig seemed to know better than to interfere once the warning signs appeared. The ocean looked alive from my window, black and unblinking, and it wasn't just the depth that unnerved me, it was the way the water seemed to weigh against the crane itself. I could feel the subtle pull, almost sentient, resisting every attempt to lift the load higher. And I realized then that Rule 1 wasn't just a precaution, it was a line between functioning and disappearing. The metal under my hands trembled slightly, and the rhythm of my own breathing seemed like a countdown. Minutes or maybe seconds, time felt slippery, passed as I wrestled with uncertainty, trying to ignore the instinctive fear rising from my stomach. The control panel lights reflected off my face, casting long shadows across my sweat-dampened forehead, and I could hear the hum of machinery that should have been steady, but instead pulsed like a living thing. Every lift I had done before felt mechanical and predictable, but this load acted independently, tugging back with an intensity that no physics lesson could explain. The air inside the cab felt thick, almost viscous, and I swore the rope vibrated in tiny pulses, communicating a warning I couldn't fully interpret. My hands itched to release control, to step back and wait for guidance, but something in me, a mixture of pride and fear, kept me rooted to the seat, staring at the gauge like it might tell me a story if I looked long enough. The radio crackled faintly with the supervisor checking on progress, but I couldn't respond without revealing my panic, so I swallowed hard and adjusted my grip instead. The shadow beneath the rig seemed to stretch further, pulling the weight in ways I couldn't predict, and I thought I caught a flicker of movement, though I couldn't be certain if it was my mind playing tricks. I remembered the briefing words vaguely: respect the rules or you won't see the surface again, and the casual way it was said earlier suddenly felt like a threat. My fingers slid slightly on the cold metal of the joystick, almost brushing the emergency release out of habit, and the sudden thought of what could happen if I acted too soon made me flinch back. There was a rhythm here, I realized, a pattern I hadn't noticed before, one that required patience, not action, and breaking that rhythm could have consequences I wasn't prepared for. I thought about the other operators I had seen, experienced hands who moved with fluid certainty, and how they seemed almost merged with the machinery, reading the subtle shifts in tension, like a language I didn't yet know. If only I could trust my own instincts, I thought, but they were raw, untrained, and prone to overreaction. Every time I glanced down at the dark, stretching water below, the pull seemed heavier, almost deliberate, and my stomach lurched as if I had seen something waiting for me. The cab suddenly felt smaller, claustrophobic in a way that had nothing to do with its size, as if the ocean itself had seeped inside to press against my ribs. I reminded myself of Rule 1 again, this time in thought rather than words, letting the words anchor me against panic while my muscles tensed and relaxed in nervous anticipation. The hours that followed blurred, time stretching into a strange elastic state, where the outside world existed only as shadow and pressure. I rotated the controls ever so slightly, making micro adjustments that were barely perceptible, careful not to overstep the boundaries the rule had set. The load beneath me seemed aware, shifting minutely in ways that mocked my understanding, tugging in rhythm with an unseen pulse from the depths. I couldn't explain why I imagined it watching, why I felt a presence there beneath the steel and water, but I knew that breaking Rule 1 would be a gamble I couldn't afford. Each flicker of the cab lights, each sway of the rig, became part of an unspoken dialogue between me and the unseen force below. I tried to record notes, thinking I might analyze the behavior later, but every movement of the pen seemed inconsequential, dwarfed by the tugging weight. The crane's cables hummed faintly, the metal vibrating under forces that weren't just physical, and I realized my body had started to sync with the tension, mirroring the strain in ways I didn't consciously control. It became impossible to separate myself from the machinery. The rule wasn't just about procedure, it was about surrendering to the rhythm, to the strange intelligence that resisted human intervention. I felt my pulse slow, then spike, as I considered the possibility that the load wasn't lifeless, that the ocean itself was testing my patience, and that any sudden movement would trigger consequences beyond my understanding. I found myself talking under my breath, muttering apologies and promises to the shadow beneath the platform, as though speaking might influence the outcome. The rule's authority became my only guide, the reminder that silence in motion was not a defect but a directive. Even as my arms ached and my eyes strained against the dim lights, I resisted the urge to override the mechanism, knowing instinctively that Rule 1, if the load goes silent before it reaches the surface, you do not try to correct the tension manually, existed for a reason that went beyond safety checklists or training manuals. The ocean's darkness pressed up to the window, opaque and infinite, and I realized that what I was holding was not just metal and cargo. It was a small, fragile line between life and disappearance. By the end of the shift, when the load finally crept upward on its own, guided by forces I couldn't explain, I slumped against the seat, drenched in sweat and disbelief. My hands shook uncontrollably, and I kept my eyes on the gauge until it settled fully, not daring to move until every ounce of resistance had passed. The other operators emerged from their stations, their expressions calm, almost knowing, while I felt as if I had glimpsed a truth I wasn't meant to articulate. Rule 1 had not just kept me alive, it had tested me in ways that logic could not account for, and even now, thinking back, I can feel the subtle tug of memory in my chest, reminding me that some rules are alive long after the moment passes. I learned Rule 2. Always double-check the load's balance before initiating any movement, no matter how experienced you are. The hard way during my second month on the rig, when overconfidence collided with exhaustion. The crane cab smelled of diesel and salt, and the overhead lights flickered faintly, reflecting off the sweat on my forehead as I adjusted the joystick. I had lifted dozens of containers before without incident, but this one felt different from the start, heavier in the middle than my calculations suggested. The cable shivered slightly, a subtle vibration that seemed almost like a warning pulse, and I realized that the physics I trusted might not account for whatever was waiting beneath the surface. Even the sea itself seemed to press against the rig legs, a slow, inexorable weight that mirrored my growing unease. I paused before giving the signal to move, tracing the load's outline with my eyes, counting the angles of its frame, and feeling the unnatural sway that shouldn't have been there. Memories of previous lifts, flawless and routine, clashed with the current unease, creating a dissonance in my mind that I couldn't shake. I kept asking myself if I was overthinking, but the rule drilled itself into my consciousness, insisting that balance could never be assumed. The control panel's lights cast long shadows across my hands, and for a moment I swore the metal itself seemed to twitch with latent movement. I whispered to no one, "Check it again, just one more time," as if repeating the phrase could stabilize not just the load, but the oppressive tension building in the cab. As I adjusted the crane, trying to find the exact equilibrium, the weight seemed to shift slightly on its own, subtle and deliberate, like a living thing testing the limits of my attention. I realized with a knot in my stomach that Rule 2 wasn't about mechanics alone. It was about respect for forces beyond comprehension, for the unseen currents and pressures lurking in the deep. The ocean stretched beneath the rig, opaque and infinite, making every micro-adjustment feel monumental. My fingers tingled with sweat, gripping the controls, every twitch amplified by the unnatural heaviness pressing through the cables. For a fleeting moment, I imagined the container below as sentient, weighing my actions, calculating my impatience, and waiting for the smallest error. The radio crackled as another operator checked in, but their words barely registered because my attention was entirely consumed by the shifting weight and the quiet insistence of the rule. Every time I glanced at the gauge, I saw not just numbers but a reflection of my own anxiety, and it was almost laughable how a single misjudgment could erase weeks of experience. The cab felt smaller as I leaned forward, trying to observe the subtle arcs of the load as it rocked imperceptibly with the wind and ocean. Even my own shadow on the console seemed distorted, stretching unnaturally along the edges of the cab, as if mirroring the tension beneath the platform. I muttered to myself about balance and precision, each word swallowed immediately by the hum of machinery and the oppressive silence outside. Sweat ran into my eyes as I performed the checks again and again, tracing the balance points, tugging slightly at the joystick to test reactions, always aware that one mistake could make the load swing uncontrollably. The swells below made every motion unpredictable, and yet I had to maintain a rhythm, a patience, a dialogue with the weight that felt both intimate and terrifying. I remembered older operators' advice. The crane listens to hesitation, and hesitation costs lives, and it finally made sense why Rule 2 was non-negotiable. The subtle movements of the metal reflected forces I could not calculate, tugging not just against gravity, but against an unseen intelligence embedded in the ocean's pressure. I felt my own heartbeat synchronize with the slight sway, every breath an attempt to anticipate the next micro-shift. Hours passed as I continued the adjustments, though time seemed fluid and indefinite, the shadows outside stretching longer with each check. My arms ached from constant vigilance, yet I could not allow the load to move even an inch without verifying its balance, because the risk of misalignment was far beyond mechanical failure. The sea below was black, deep, infinite, and I began to feel the weight of isolation pressing as much as the steel and cargo. Even the humming of the crane became a kind of communication, vibrating in resonance with the unseen forces, and I found myself listening more than acting. Every micro-correction became a negotiation, a tentative dialogue with gravity and pressure and something I could not name. At one point, I thought I saw a shadow move beneath the water, not the load, but something larger, stretching and elongating with the currents. I froze, gripping the controls, heart pounding, and reminded myself of Rule 2 internally, letting the reminder ground me as I resisted the urge to panic. The shadow seemed to shift in response to my hesitation, testing my reaction, and I realized then that the rule was not just about physics, but about control, about patience, about surrendering to the rhythm of forces I could not fully perceive. My mind tried to reason through it, but logic failed against the stubborn insistence of imbalance that pressed against every part of the crane. By the end of the shift, after countless micro-adjustments, repeated measurements, and careful observation, the load finally moved smoothly when I began the lift, as if acknowledging my respect for the rule. My muscles trembled with exhaustion, eyes dry and stinging, and I slumped back into the seat, acutely aware of the fragile boundary between mastery and disaster. Rule 2 had not only prevented an accident, but had impressed upon me the subtle weight of responsibility, the sense that every motion, every breath, every glance at the gauge was part of a living dialogue with the ocean itself. Even now, recalling that night, I can feel the residual tension, a phantom tug reminding me that the deep remembers every lapse, every hesitation, and every disregard for the rules. I remember the night I first realized the weight of Rule 3. Never operate the crane alone during high seas or night shifts. Regardless of experience, standing in the cab with only the dim red lights to illuminate the control panels. The wind had picked up, rattling the rig's structure, and the waves crashed so hard against the platform legs that the entire crane shuddered with each impact. I had been confident earlier that night, thinking experience could substitute for company, but the isolation began to feel like a living thing pressing against the glass. The ocean outside was black, infinite, and every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, teasing the edge of my vision. My fingers hovered over the joystick, hesitant, as though acknowledging some unspoken boundary I had already crossed. The first warning came subtly, with a tiny jerk in the cable that no one else could hear or see, but my body felt it immediately. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was fatigue or imagination, but my instincts screamed otherwise. The load beneath me swayed slightly, as if the deep was testing me, and I realized that Rule 3 wasn't about rules written in a handbook. It was about human limitation against the ocean's unpredictable will. Every creak of the rig sounded amplified, resonating inside my chest like a countdown. The red lights flickered briefly, casting the cab in shadows that danced in rhythm with the sway, and I caught my own reflection, pale and tense, staring back as if it belonged to someone else. I thought about what it would mean to call for help, to break protocol, but the comms were patchy, distorted by the storm, and each attempt to reach another operator resulted in static or delayed replies. My heart raced, and I could feel the tension of the cable thrumming through the metal, vibrating into my seat. The crane felt heavier in my hands, the controls almost resisting me, as if acknowledging my solo presence. I realized that Rule 3 demanded more than a buddy. It demanded respect for the unseen currents, the unpredictable weights, and the psychological toll that solitude exacted. The shadows beneath the rig moved slightly with the currents, and I imagined them testing my resolve, probing the edges of my focus, and daring me to make a mistake. As minutes bled into what felt like hours, I became hyper-aware of every detail. The subtle sway of the platform, the pulsing vibration of the cable, the faint creak of the rig's joints, and even the rhythm of my own breathing. I tried to center myself, telling myself that experience should be enough, but the isolation pressed inward, a physical weight on my chest. Each decision felt amplified, the smallest misjudgment threatening to cascade into disaster. I realized then that Rule 3 wasn't about physical presence. It was about psychological stability, about ensuring that no single mind bore the entire weight of the rig and the ocean alone. The waves outside continued to swell, unrelenting, while my muscles ached from tension and my eyes burned from staring at the cable. The night seemed endless as I adjusted the crane inch by inch, constantly aware of my own vulnerability. I imagined someone beside me, even silently observing, and it would have made all the difference. A second set of eyes, a voice to argue or reassure, a hand to steady the controls. Without that, every sway of the load, every vibration in the cable, became a personal challenge, testing not just my skill, but my sanity. I started muttering instructions to myself, fragmented sentences that had no audience but my own growing sense of dread. Rule 3 echoed in my mind, warning me that solitude was the hidden danger, the silent predator that preyed on overconfidence. Even as I tried to rationalize, the rig seemed to become a living organism, moving subtly in ways I could not predict, the ocean's pulse insinuating itself into the cab. By the third hour, fatigue had begun to fracture my focus, and I felt the first tendrils of panic curl around my thoughts. The cable pulsed under my hands, and I swore I saw the shadow of the load stretch and twist beneath the red glow, responding to my hesitations. I realized that breaking Rule 3 had consequences that extended beyond physical danger. My perception of reality was bending under the pressure of isolation and responsibility. The storm outside continued unabated, and the rig groaned as though it were alive, the sound penetrating the cab in low, resonant waves. I wanted to shout, to summon anyone, anything, for reassurance, but the comms mocked me with intermittent static and empty replies. I tried to focus on the routine checks I had memorized, tracing each lever, gauge, and button with obsessive care, but my mind kept returning to the same gnawing thought: if anything went wrong, I would be utterly alone. I felt the cab tilt slightly with the rig's movement, and my stomach lurched at the subtle shift that shouldn't have affected me, and yet did. The isolation amplified everything: the cold, the weight of the load, the hum of the machinery, the unceasing darkness outside. Every movement of the crane became a dialogue with forces I could barely comprehend, and the psychological strain was as tangible as the physical exertion. I whispered to the empty cab, promising that I would stay calm, that I would obey Rule 3, even though I was the only one present to enforce it. Hours later, I finally began to trust the movement of the load, inch by inch, as it responded predictably to careful manipulation. My limbs ached, my eyes burned, and yet a sense of cautious relief started to replace the panic. The shadows beneath the rig still twisted with the waves, but they no longer seemed malevolent, more like indifferent observers to my adherence to Rule 3. I realized that the rule had taught me more than caution. It had revealed the fragile limits of human focus, endurance, and sanity in isolation. As I finally secured the load in place, my hands trembling, I understood that no amount of experience could substitute for the presence of another human mind in moments of unyielding pressure. The night remained long, the storm relentless, but I survived it, and the memory of solitude and the lesson of Rule 3 stayed with me in every lift I performed thereafter. I first felt the significance of Rule 4. Never ignore unusual vibrations or resistance, even if instruments read normal on a night when the ocean was unusually calm, almost deceptively so, and the rig's steel seemed to hum under a hidden tension. The crane cab smelled faintly of ozone and oil, mixed with the briny tang of the sea, and the overhead lights flickered sporadically, reflecting off the gauges. I had been trained to trust the instruments above all else, to rely on numbers and readings rather than intuition. But that night, the cables pulsed with a subtle, almost sentient rhythm that the dials failed to capture. I adjusted the controls slightly, testing the sway of the load, and the metal shivered in response, as though alive. My stomach churned with the realization that something existed beyond the measurable, and that Rule 4 was designed to teach obedience to senses that instruments could not quantify. The vibration started faintly at first, like a low thrum through my hands, barely perceptible if I had not been paying attention. I paused, feeling it resonate through the crane cab floor into my boots, as though the rig itself were trying to communicate. I glanced at the gauge, which stubbornly read 0 irregularities, and a shiver of unease ran down my spine. The ocean outside stretched into darkness, its surface reflecting the rig's lights in fractured shards, and I felt the subtle weight of isolation pressing in on me. The load beneath swayed minutely, resisting my adjustments, testing my patience and skill, and I realized that Rule 4 wasn't about mistrust of technology. It was about respecting the unpredictable forces lurking in the deep. I muttered under my breath, "Don't ignore it, pay attention," almost as if speaking aloud could validate my instincts. Minutes blurred as I continued monitoring the vibrations, adjusting micro movements to counteract the invisible resistance, feeling the strain in my shoulders and forearms grow exponentially. The load's subtle shifts became more pronounced, almost teasing, and I could swear it pulsed in opposition to my intentions, not merely reacting to gravity. My mind raced with calculations, but the numbers felt hollow compared to the tangible feedback coursing through the controls. The red lights overhead threw elongated shadows across the cab, making the gauges and buttons seem otherworldly, and the hum of the machinery felt amplified, vibrating in harmony with the unseen pull below. Each adjustment I made was measured and deliberate, yet the resistance persisted, testing not just the load's balance, but my own concentration. I recalled stories from seasoned operators about lifts where instruments failed them, where readings suggested safety, but reality had a different rhythm. One man had described the sensation as the weight having its own heartbeat, and I began to understand exactly what he meant. The crane cab, usually so familiar, became an alien environment, every vibration and sway a communication I had to interpret. The shadows of the rig's structure twisted oddly under the lights, and the faint creak of metal seemed almost vocal, echoing the pulse of the ocean beneath. I whispered to myself, promising caution, repeating silently the mantra embedded in Rule 4, that ignoring these subtle signals could end badly. I adjusted the load slowly, testing its response, feeling every micro pulse as if it were a heartbeat trying to tell me something. Hours dragged as I remained hyper-aware of the vibrations, my body tensed to detect even the slightest anomaly. The calm of the ocean made it worse. Without waves to mask the strain, every micro-resistance became amplified in perception. The load beneath me seemed to twist almost independently, sometimes in counter-rhythm, and I found myself second-guessing every decision. My vision began to blur slightly, fatigue creeping in, yet I could not relax, because Rule 4 demanded vigilance against forces that were impossible to measure. The shadows outside stretched unnaturally, as if aware of my hesitation, and the air in the cab felt heavier with each passing minute, pressing down, urging me to pay attention. I tried to communicate with the other operator on the rig, but the storm outside interfered with the comms, static swallowing most of the words. I found myself gesturing and muttering to the empty cab, as though it could respond, as if I had become part of the machinery, and the vibrations were a dialogue. The load's subtle resistance teased me further, forcing me to adjust endlessly, while the shadows below seemed to stretch into unknown depths. Even though the instruments stubbornly read normal, my hands and chest told a different story, every pulse of vibration, a warning that Rule 4 was not just about mechanics, but about survival instincts, ignored at peril. I felt my own heartbeat sync with the micro-movements of the load, every nerve alive, every sense alert to signals no gauge could translate. Time became meaningless as I moved slowly, deliberately, coaxing the load to shift without resistance, while my mind replayed every cautionary tale I had been told in training. I realized the cab itself had become a lens for perception, amplifying each subtle tremor, each whisper of strain through the machinery, and forcing me to acknowledge what the instruments refused to report. Every adjustment, every measured sway, felt like negotiating with a conscious entity beneath the rig, a presence embedded in steel and ocean that responded to human error. The lights flickered again, shadows twisting in response to the faint pulsing vibrations, and I realized that Rule 4 was as much about respect for the unseen as it was about action. By the time the shift ended, I was exhausted, muscles trembling, eyes raw from staring, yet acutely aware of the lesson ingrained by Rule 4. The load was finally stable, but the memory of its subtle teasing resistance remained imprinted in my mind. I knew that ignoring even the smallest vibration or resistance, even when instruments insisted everything was normal, could have led to disaster. The ocean beneath continued its silent, indifferent motion, but I felt its presence, the invisible pulse through the steel, and the rule's lesson burned into me. Survival required listening with every sense, not just trusting readings. The shadows outside had faded into ordinary darkness, but in my mind, they still whispered, and I understood that Rule 4 would haunt every lift I performed from that night onward. I first learned the gravity of Rule 5, never release the load without a second pair of eyes confirming clearance, even for routine lifts on a quiet, moonless night when the rig seemed suspended between shadow and sea. The cab smelled of salt, sweat, and grease, mingling into an oppressive fog that seemed to settle around my shoulders. I had performed dozens of lifts before, each seemingly routine, and the temptation to trust my own judgment felt irresistible. But that night, hesitation whispered its caution. The ocean outside stretched infinite and black, reflecting nothing, swallowing the platform's legs in depthless darkness, and I realized that even the simplest action required more than confidence. My hands hovered over the release lever, the controls feeling heavier than usual, as though the cable itself demanded a witness. I glanced at the monitor, then the empty deck below, and the silence of the rig pressed like weight on my chest. Each cable shiver, each tremor through the load became magnified in my awareness, demanding scrutiny beyond what instruments could offer. I could almost feel the presence of another consciousness, observing the motion beneath, anticipating errors I could not detect. The wind lashed against the rig, making the cab sway imperceptibly, and I understood that Rule 5 wasn't about protocol alone. It was about survival, about mitigating the invisible consequences of overconfidence. I whispered, almost involuntarily, someone else confirm. But there was no one, and the echo of my words seemed absorbed by the metal in the Black Sea below. The temptation to act, to release the load and proceed as if all were normal, was strong. I had memorized the clearances, known the angles, and trusted the routine, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. The shadows of the crane and platform seemed to elongate unnaturally, and the reflection of my own hands on the control panels startled me as if they belonged to a stranger. Every minor sway of the load became amplified, each micro-movement a test of my attention and composure. I thought of previous incidents where even experienced operators made a single misjudgment, and the consequences had been irreversible. Rule 5 became a mantra, an internal anchor against my growing impatience, a reminder that verification was not optional, even when the lift seemed trivial. Minutes stretched into hours as I meticulously inspected the load, checking angles, alignment, and the faintest indications of resistance or imbalance. My mind cycled between calculation and instinct, weighing measured confidence against the persistent unease that had grown with the darkness. The load pulsed slightly against its restraints, almost teasing, and I found myself imagining how it might react if released prematurely. Each sway, however minor, carried with it the terrifying potential of catastrophe. I whispered apologies to the empty cab, to the invisible watchers below, as if acknowledgement could influence fate. Rule 5 was not merely about a partner observing, it was about acknowledging the uncertainty embedded in every lift, every shadow, every micro-adjustment that escaped measurement. The hours felt suspended, the rig moving subtly with the tides, and the weight beneath seemed alive, resisting the calm logic of machinery. My focus became singular, a delicate balance between the load's behavior and my own physical responses. Every micro-vibration and slight resistance became a language, one I had to interpret to avoid disaster. Even the faint humming of the cab's machinery seemed to take on a rhythm, pulsing in sync with the subtle shifts of the load. I reminded myself that ignoring Rule 5 could undo years of training and experience, yet the isolation made compliance feel almost punitive. I longed for another pair of eyes, another presence, someone to confirm that my adjustments were correct and that the release would be safe. The shadows outside stretched and warped with the moonless night, and I imagined them observing every slight misstep, every hesitation, every micro-adjustment. I could feel the metal of the crane vibrating slightly beneath my hands, each subtle pulse a warning that the deep had a memory and a patience I could not match. Releasing the load without confirmation would be to gamble with forces I could not see or measure. My mind kept returning to the mantra of Rule 5, letting it anchor my actions, yet the isolation gnawed at the edges of my focus. I spoke to myself quietly, repeating safety checks, tracing angles, imagining someone else's eyes verifying every move, even though no one was there. By the time I finally initiated the release, cautiously and incrementally, I realized that my adherence to Rule 5 had not only prevented an accident, but had transformed my understanding of the lift entirely. The weight responded to the adjustments, moving with deliberate, almost sentient compliance, as though it had waited for my patience to align with its rhythm. The ocean beneath continued its indifferent motion, vast and infinite, but the lesson of the rule remained tangible in my muscles, my hands, and my mind. I understood then that even routine lifts carried uncertainty, and that a second perspective, even unseen, was vital. The shadows of the rig stretched long, blending with the night, yet I felt the quiet assurance that compliance with Rule 5 had kept disaster at bay. Even after the load was fully secured, my hands trembling and body exhausted, I could still feel the residual pulse of tension lingering in the cables. a reminder that the ocean and its cargo had their own memory. Each lift from that point forward was approached with meticulous care, a constant awareness of unseen variables, and the necessity of verification. Rule 5 had not just taught caution, it had demonstrated the invisible thread connecting action and consequence, and the subtle power of diligence over assumption. The rig's shadows seemed calm now, yet I knew that they remembered every lapse, every hesitation, and that survival depended on adherence to rules that demanded respect beyond understanding. By the end of the shift, when the night gave way to a pale pre-dawn, I slumped back in the crane cab, drained yet profoundly aware of what compliance with Rule 5 had accomplished. The load sat silently in place, stable, yet the memory of its subtle resistance, of my isolation and anticipation, remained imprinted on every nerve. I knew that even the simplest actions carried risk, and that verification was a bridge between competence and catastrophe. The rig itself seemed to exhale in quiet acknowledgement, and I understood that Rule 5 was more than protocol. It was a tether between human judgment and the vast unknowable forces of the deep. I first grasped the weight of Rule 6. Always maintain visual contact with the load. Never rely solely on instruments or cameras during a stormy night. When the rig rocked violently and the cab lights flickered sporadically, the ocean beyond the platform was black and infinite, waves slamming against the legs with relentless force, making every movement of the crane feel precarious. I had relied too often on monitors and cameras for convenience, trusting them more than my eyes, and the lesson arrived like a cold shock in the pit of my stomach. The load beneath me seemed to move subtly on its own, twisting with the swells, defying the mechanical precision I tried to impose. My hands gripped the joystick tightly, knuckles white, as I realized that detachment from direct observation had been a mistake. The first moment of panic hit when the camera feed froze for a split second, leaving me to rely on the gauges and instinct alone. The load swayed imperceptibly during that time, almost testing my patience, and my heart leapt as I saw a shadow flicker beneath it, through the small, dimly lit window. The rhythm of the rig creaking and groaning mixed with the wind, creating an almost hypnotic pulse that made it difficult to focus. Yet I forced myself to watch every subtle movement. I reminded myself internally of Rule 6, forcing my mind to reject complacency and reassert the necessity of visual vigilance. The load's behavior was too unpredictable, and the instruments could not capture the nuanced shifts that my own eyes could. Every shadow, every reflection became part of a language I had to interpret to avoid disaster. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, each adjustment requiring me to balance instinct, observation, and the guidance of the instruments simultaneously. The ocean beyond pressed against the rig like a living weight, amplifying every sway and vibration of the load. I could feel the tension of the cables reverberate through the metal and into my arms, but it was the subtle visual cues, the angles, the shadows, the tiny hesitations in movement that kept me alive. The storm outside created strange illusions in the black water, waves forming shapes that disappeared before I could fully comprehend them. I spoke quietly to myself, naming movements and shifts, as if verbalizing my observations could reinforce my focus and maintain the connection between my eyes and the load. I remembered previous lifts where I had ignored visual cues, relying instead on the supposed infallibility of instruments, and the memory of the near accidents made my stomach churn. The crane's cables thrummed under invisible pressure, and the load resisted in ways that the gauges simply could not report. Each slight twist or sway became magnified in perception, demanding immediate correction through visual judgment. The red lights inside the cab cast long shadows across the control panels, distorting the gauges and screens into shapes that seemed almost alive. I reminded myself again of Rule 6, internalizing its necessity, because instruments alone could not anticipate the subtle sentient-like responses of the load as it interacted with the storm and the invisible currents beneath the rig. The storm intensified, and each wave sent tremors through the platform that shifted the entire rig by centimeters, enough to affect the load in ways the cameras couldn't capture. My eyes strained to maintain focus, scanning for the smallest deviation, the imperceptible tilt that could escalate into catastrophe. Every moment of inattention or glance away felt like a gamble with fate, and I realized that reliance on screens had dulled my senses over time, eroding the instincts I now desperately needed. The cab seemed suspended between chaos and stillness, the wind, the waves, and the metal of the rig merging into a single, overwhelming presence. I whispered to myself, urging patience and clarity, forcing my eyes to follow every movement and contour of the load directly, letting no detail escape. Hours passed in a haze of tension, each moment compounded by fatigue and isolation. My shoulders ached, my vision blurred, yet I could not allow myself to look away. The load's subtle shifts demanded full attention, micro movements amplified by the swaying platform and the relentless storm. Shadows beneath the rig twisted and stretched, interacting with the waves in ways that seemed deliberate, almost sentient, and I realized that visual vigilance was as much a psychological necessity as a practical one. Each glance away, even for a second, seemed to carry the threat of catastrophe, and I forced myself to trace the load's outline, every edge and angle, to anticipate any resistance or imbalance. My heartbeat synced with the sways and pulses of the crane, the storm, and the load itself, creating a rhythm that tethered me to reality amidst the chaos. I recalled tales from older operators about the consequences of ignoring visual cues, about how instruments could mislead when conditions were extreme, and I understood finally why the rule existed. It was not merely precautionary, it was survival, training the mind to perceive subtle signals that technology could not translate. The storm outside continued unabated, waves hammering the platform legs in unpredictable sequences, shadows dancing across the water with every swell. Even as my body ached and my vision blurred from continuous strain, I refused to rely on screens or numbers alone, knowing instinct and observation were now my only allies. Each minor adjustment, every shift of the joystick, demanded confirmation from my eyes, a direct visual understanding of the load's behavior against the unrelenting environment. The hours continued, stretching into a night that seemed infinite, and I began to feel the psychological weight of total responsibility pressing on me. My mind alternated between acute focus and near fatigue-induced hallucinations, shadows of the rig blending with reflections on the water, testing my concentration. The ocean itself seemed aware of my gaze, shifting subtly with my attention, and I understood that Rule 6 was as much about mental endurance as it was about practical safety. Every movement, every pulse, and every shadow beneath the load demanded recognition and response. I spoke softly to myself, naming actions and movements, reinforcing my connection to the load through spoken observation, a lifeline amidst the isolating storm. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the load settled as intended, moving in harmony with my careful adjustments. The cables taut, and the platform stabilized. I slumped back in the cab, drenched in sweat and salt, aware of how close the misjudgment of visual reliance could have brought catastrophe. The lesson of Rule 6 had been seared into my consciousness. Instruments could guide, but only human sight and judgment could navigate the subtle sentient-like resistance of the deep and the unpredictable forces above. Shadows of the rig and waves outside no longer seemed threatening, yet I knew that the memory of their silent testing would remain, a permanent reminder of why the rule existed. My body and mind remained keyed to vigilance, aware that the ocean's depths remembered every lapse, every glance away, and that survival required eyes on the load, always. I first understood the weight of Rule 7. Never leave the crane unattended while a load is suspended, even for brief distractions during a fog-heavy morning, when the rig seems swallowed by mist, turning the ocean into a flat, gray expanse. I had stepped briefly to check the control panel behind me, thinking the load was stable, confident that a moment of inattention wouldn't matter. But when I returned, the subtle sway of the load had increased imperceptibly, twisting in ways that the gauges failed to register. My stomach lurched, a cold, tightening knot forming, as I realized that even a few seconds away could be catastrophic. Shadows of the rig and cables shifted with the fog, elongated and warped, making the load seem almost alive, testing boundaries I had assumed were secure. The hum of the crane pulsed beneath my hands as I returned to the controls, every micro vibration magnified, every subtle tilt amplified by the cab's suspended isolation. The fog outside seemed to carry sound and pressure differently, muting some cues and exaggerating others, forcing me to rely entirely on touch, sight, and instinct. I remembered the stories from older operators, accidents caused not by inexperience, but by brief lapses in attention, and a creeping dread settled into my chest. Rule 7 was no longer a guideline, it was a lifeline, a tether between control and chaos, reminding me that even the briefest lapse could invite disaster. My hands gripped the joystick tightly, knuckles pale, as I watched the cable tremble slightly, a pulse too subtle for instruments but impossible to ignore. Time warped as I focused exclusively on maintaining the load, the fog outside swallowing distance and depth, creating an illusion that the platform floated in a void. Every sound, every vibration, every subtle movement of the load became magnified, an amplified warning of what could go wrong if attention faltered again. The shadows of the crane legs stretched unnaturally across the mist, and I imagined them moving deliberately, testing my vigilance. My mind replayed previous lifts, where I had been entirely attentive, contrasting them with this single misstep, however brief, and I realized the psychological weight of Rule 7 was as heavy as the steel suspended above the ocean. The fog seemed alive, pressing against the cab and cables, as if the ocean itself demanded obedience. As hours passed, my body grew tense, every muscle engaged, my eyes straining to follow the load's slightest motion. The mist shifted constantly, and shadows formed and dissolved, giving the impression of movement in the water below where none existed. I found myself muttering instructions and warnings under my breath, as though vocalizing my focus could anchor reality. The cables pulsed subtly with the weight, transmitting micro vibrations that I interpreted as signals, warning me against distraction. Even a brief glance away, a fleeting hesitation, seemed magnified into risk, reinforcing the critical nature of Rule 7. My hands remained locked on the controls, every adjustment deliberate, every motion measured, as I learned the cost of even a momentary lapse. The storm outside was building slowly, a low swell growing into a persistent push against the rig legs, making the suspended load respond in ways that instruments failed to capture. I imagined the cables stretching and twisting like living tendrils, sensitive to any reduction in vigilance. The fog made distance deceptive, and the horizon was invisible, leaving the rig suspended in an uncanny, weightless space. The psychological pressure of being entirely responsible for the load, alone, in the midst of the storm and fog, became almost unbearable. I repeated Rule 7 silently to myself, letting it reinforce a tether to reality, reminding me that my own eyes and attention were now the only barrier between stability and disaster. Hours melted into one continuous tension, the fog thickening around the rig and transforming ordinary shadows into ambiguous forms. Every tremor in the load became a question, every sway a test of my attention, and my heartbeat synced with the pulses beneath the steel. The ocean's silence, broken only by distant waves crashing against submerged supports, seemed to mock the rigidity of the rule, as if the deep were testing my resolve. My mind started to blur at the edges, fatigue gnawing at perception, yet I could not allow even the briefest lapse, knowing the load below would punish error mercilessly. I whispered apologies and promises under my breath, not to anyone else, but as if speaking might anchor the suspended reality of the crane and load. Eventually, the load stabilized, each micro-adjustment aligning it perfectly with the rig's platform, yet the lingering tension remained, etched into my muscles, my mind, and the memory of the fog-filled morning. I slumped against the control panel, exhausted, acutely aware of how dangerously close the brief distraction had brought me. Rule 7 had not only taught caution but demanded humility, showing that even experience and competence could not substitute for absolute vigilance. The fog outside began to lift, revealing the black expanse of water below, yet I could still feel the pulse of the suspended load and the fragile tether of control I had maintained. The lesson lingered, a reminder that no distraction, no matter how brief, was worth compromising the balance between the rig, the load, and the deep. By the end of the shift, as the sun broke over the horizon and painted the rig in stark light, I realized that Rule 7 had become more than a guideline. It was an imprint on my consciousness, a permanent awareness that attention was inseparable from survival. Every lift thereafter was approached with renewed focus, meticulous checks, and an acute understanding of the cost of even a single second of negligence. The shadows of the rig had faded with the fog, but the lesson remained. The ocean, the load, and the cables remembered, and inattention would never be forgiven. I first realized the deadly significance of Rule 8. Always account for the ocean's unexpected currents. Assume nothing is ever truly still on a morning when the sea appeared deceptively calm, glassy under a pale sun, and the rig seemed to float suspended in perfect serenity. I had been lifting a heavy container, assuming my calculations accounted for every variable: weight, angle, and crane tension. But the first subtle tug from below reminded me of my arrogance. The cables shivered lightly, a barely perceptible pulse, as if the ocean itself had decided to test my attention. My hands tightened on the controls instinctively, but I could already feel the rhythm of the deep, a hidden force beneath the surface that no gauge could quantify. Shadows of the rig's legs stretched into the water, twisted by light and reflection, and I realized that Rule 8 demanded respect for the unseen forces that governed every lift. The currents began to reveal themselves gradually, gentle at first, tugging the load in ways that defied expectation and measurement. I instinctively adjusted, micro-corrections through the joystick, but each response seemed to provoke another subtle movement, as though the ocean were alive, teasing my competence. The rig swayed slightly with each pulse, amplifying the effect and forcing my mind to process variables far beyond standard calculations. I reminded myself of Rule 8, feeling the psychological pressure that accompanied acknowledgement of the ocean's unpredictable will. Even the smallest misjudgment could escalate into disaster, and I realized that my own perception of stillness had been dangerously misleading. Hours passed in constant vigilance, each adjustment demanding full attention, as currents beneath twisted the load subtly, imperceptibly at first, then with more insistence. The reflection of clouds on the water's surface created illusions of movement, and shadows played tricks on my eyes, making it difficult to distinguish reality from perception. Each time I relaxed, the load shifted unexpectedly, reminding me that the calm was deceptive and temporary. My mind began to strain, oscillating between trust in experience and fear of unseen variables, as Rule 8 anchored my awareness, a constant reminder that the ocean had no respect for routine. I whispered to myself, naming movements and tracing the subtle shifts in the load, as if verbalizing them could prevent catastrophe. The currents were relentless, invisible yet forceful, and I realized that every moment of complacency amplified risk. The weight of responsibility pressed against my chest, as if the deep was aware of my underestimation, testing vigilance and patience. Even instruments, calibrated to detect movement, failed to capture the nuanced influence of the ocean, leaving me to rely entirely on visual observation and instinct. Shadows of the crane and rig distorted unnaturally in response to the waves, seeming to twist and stretch beneath the surface. I muttered silently, repeating Rule 8, forcing myself to respect forces I could neither see nor predict, understanding that survival relied on constant anticipation and unwavering attention. As fatigue set in, the subtle currents became more disorienting, blending with the motion of the rig and the sway of the suspended load. My eyes strained to detect every micro-shift, every tug that hinted at deeper forces, while my body tensed with each adjustment. Even brief lapses in focus allowed the ocean to assert its influence, subtly bending cables, twisting containers, and testing my reflexes. I felt the isolation acutely, the rig floating in the vast expanse of water, with the deep beneath exerting a silent, persistent presence. Rule 8 became more than a guideline. It was a lifeline, tethering my attention to the reality of the deep's invisible strength. The subtle tugging of the currents seemed almost deliberate, as if the ocean had a consciousness of its own, judging my every move. The load twisted slightly against my corrections, each micro-resistance demanding instant response. The rig groaned softly, the metal vibrating in tandem with the underwater forces, while shadows cast by cables and machinery warped and elongated in ways that unnerved me. Every pulse of the cable, every sway of the load, became a reminder that calm was an illusion and stillness a myth. I spoke quietly to myself, reinforcing Rule 8, naming every tug, every sway, every subtle anomaly, as if speaking aloud could synchronize human judgment with the unpredictable rhythm of the sea. By the afternoon, my mind was exhausted, but the lesson of Rule 8 remained vivid. The ocean's currents were a force beyond measurement, demanding respect, vigilance, and humility. Each subtle resistance, every imperceptible sway, was a reminder that the environment was a living, reactive entity, capable of punishing even minor errors. I realized that survival required not just skill, but continuous observation, anticipation, and responsiveness. The calm water no longer comforted me. It was a warning, a deceptive surface concealing forces I could neither control nor fully predict. My hands remained steady on the controls, reflexively compensating for every micro-tug, every whisper of movement beneath the rig. Even as the day drew to a close, shadows lengthening and blending into the blackness of the approaching evening, I remained hyper-aware of every subtle sway, every pulse in the cables, and every reflection on the water. The ocean beneath had taught me that stillness was an illusion, and that Rule 8 demanded perpetual attention, respect for unseen forces, and acknowledgement of limits. My muscles ached, eyes burned, but I could not relax, knowing that the smallest lapse in vigilance would have catastrophic consequences. Each subtle movement was a message, and I had to remain attuned to its rhythm, to maintain control, to survive, and to respect the immutable laws of the deep. By the time the night fell completely, I had navigated the load through the invisible currents without incident, yet the psychological imprint of the lesson lingered. The ocean, vast and inscrutable, had reminded me that assumptions were dangerous, and that Rule 8 was not just procedural, it was survival. The shadows and reflections outside no longer seemed random but purposeful, subtle signals of the underlying power that governed every motion. Even as fatigue pressed against me, I understood that compliance with the rule had kept disaster at bay. The lesson of the currents, invisible yet potent, remained burned into my awareness, a permanent reminder that the deep never rested, and neither could I. I first grasped the deadly truth of Rule 9. Never trust machinery that shows minor glitches. Small faults can escalate into fatal errors on a night when the rig's hum felt off, uneven, like a heartbeat struggling to maintain rhythm. I had noticed a subtle lag in the crane's responsiveness, a fraction of a second delay in the joystick's command, and I thought I could compensate mentally. But the ocean doesn't forgive assumptions, and the load beneath me swayed slightly, testing my reflexes and patience simultaneously. The faint stutter of the machinery felt like a warning, almost imperceptible, yet my gut screamed that ignoring it would be catastrophic. Shadows of the rig stretched across the water's surface, warped by moonlight, and I realized that Rule 9 wasn't about fear. It was about respect for the delicate balance between man, machine, and deep-sea forces. The first real test came when a minor warning light blinked sporadically, fading as if shy, yet I felt the underlying tremor in the metal beneath my seat. I adjusted the load slightly, but the pulsing hesitation returned, subtle yet undeniable, reminding me that these minor faults could magnify into uncontrollable errors. I recalled previous incidents, shared quietly among operators, where small malfunctions had cascaded into tragedy. The load shifted again, responding unpredictably to commands I had once performed flawlessly. My mind raced, calculating corrections while trying to reconcile instinct with mechanical feedback, knowing that a single misjudgment could end in disaster. Rule 9 had become a mantra, guiding every thought, every adjustment, every breath, as I navigated the frail line between control and chaos. Hours stretched endlessly as I compensated for the minor glitches, each adjustment requiring microscopic precision, every twitch of the crane, a potential signal of escalation. The shadows of cables and rig legs warped under the cab lights, creating illusions that seemed almost alive, feeding the tension already building in my chest. The ocean outside moved subtly, deceptively calm, yet I felt its pulse through the swaying of the load, amplifying the consequences of even minor mechanical hesitation. I whispered to myself, repeating Rule 9, mentally noting every stutter, every flicker of resistance, knowing that ignoring these small anomalies could allow them to spiral into disaster. Every heartbeat seemed synchronized with the tremor of the crane, every nerve attuned to detect what instruments failed to report. The machinery's hesitation worsened subtly, a tiny but persistent lag that forced me to anticipate every movement instead of simply reacting. My muscles tensed constantly, and my mind flickered between trust and experience and fear of hidden dangers. The load beneath me swayed against commands at times, responding not to physics alone, but to imperfections that instruments couldn't fully quantify. Shadows under the rig twisted and shifted in tandem with the vibrations, making it impossible to ignore the message encoded in Rule 9. Small faults were warnings, precursors of events far beyond my control. Each flicker of the lights, each minor jerk of the cables, became a communication I had to interpret correctly, or risk disaster. Isolation made everything more intense. With no other eyes to verify or assist, I became acutely aware of how reliance on machinery could betray even the most skilled operator. The faint, intermittent hum of the crane felt like a living pulse, sometimes off-kilter, sometimes almost imperceptible, but always demanding acknowledgement. I spoke quietly to myself, naming every glitch, tracking every minor hesitation, treating each as a potential hazard that could escalate in seconds. The ocean beneath, indifferent and immense, amplified every small error, echoing through the cables and metal, as if testing the consequences of ignoring Rule 9. Each micro-correction became a battle between instinct, experience, and the fragile reliability of the machinery I was tethered to. Time dissolved as I maintained relentless focus, muscles straining, eyes burning, every second magnified by isolation and pressure. Even the smallest hesitation in machinery now felt like a conversation, a warning from metal and hydraulics that required total attention. The shadows of the crane legs, dancing with the reflection of moonlight on the water, reminded me of how deceptive calm could be. I adjusted, recalibrated, and corrected with painstaking care, guided by intuition as much as experience. Rule 9 anchored me, a constant reminder that survival relied not on blind trust, but on vigilance, anticipation, and respect for the unpredictable escalation that small mechanical faults could cause. The hours were long, each correction meticulously applied, the ocean beneath unmoved by my struggle yet omnipresent in its influence. My mind mapped every pulse, every flicker, every subtle hesitation of the crane, merging instinct with observation to compensate for the imperfect machinery. I realized that even the smallest glitch could ripple into consequences that were catastrophic, far beyond what any instruments could report. The shadows of the rig and the load seemed alive, responding subtly to each of my micro-adjustments. I whispered Rule 9 quietly to myself, allowing it to steady my nerves and focus, to maintain awareness of every imperfection that could spiral into disaster. By the night's end, the machinery finally settled, the minor glitches subsiding as if they had tested my resolve and patience. My body was trembling, drained from hours of micro-adjustments, yet the lesson of Rule 9 was imprinted in every muscle, every nerve, every thought. The ocean remained indifferent, shadows dissipated, but I understood that no machinery could ever be wholly trusted, no instrument wholly reliable. Vigilance, respect, and anticipation were the only tools that could mediate between human control and mechanical imperfection. Even after the load was secured, my awareness of the subtle, potentially fatal flaws lingered, a permanent echo of the night's lesson, and a reminder that Rule 9 was as much psychological as practical. I first learned the terrifying reality of Rule 10. Never assume the environment around the rig is predictable. The deep can change in an instant during a pre-dawn shift. When the ocean seemed unnaturally calm, a deceptive mirror reflecting the dim glow of the rig's lights. I had checked the gauges, watched the horizon, and assumed that everything was stable, lulled into a false sense of security. But a subtle shift beneath the rig's legs told me otherwise. The water moved differently, faster, with invisible undercurrents tugging at the supports. The load above me swayed in ways my calculations hadn't predicted, responding to forces beyond comprehension, and I felt the pulse of the deep testing every decision I made. Shadows from the crane stretched across the surface of the water, twisting with every micro swell, and I realized that Rule 10 demanded constant vigilance against the unseen, the unpredictable, and the dangerously deceptive. The first indication of true danger came when the horizon, previously a smooth line, appeared to ripple subtly, almost imperceptibly, betraying the motion of underwater currents that instruments failed to detect. I tried to compensate by adjusting the crane, micro-corrections transmitted through fingers and muscles, but the water seemed to pull at the rig and load with its own intent. I muttered to myself, reminding me silently of Rule 10, forcing my mind to respect that the ocean's surface could not reveal the hidden chaos beneath. The shadows cast by cables and machinery elongated and warped in the dim light, creating the illusion of movement where none should exist. I realized immediately that predictability was an illusion. Every second, every movement carried risk beyond measurement. As minutes passed, the subtle shifts intensified, and the load began to respond unpredictably, tilting ever so slightly, resisting my attempts to stabilize it. The rig creaked under the hidden force, vibrations moving through steel and into my arms, a reminder of the immense power below. I forced myself to stay calm, repeating Rule 10 mentally, acknowledging that the ocean could change in an instant, that reliance on routine and assumption would be fatal. Each shadow, each reflection, seemed to hint at movement beneath the surface, suggesting currents strong enough to throw even a seasoned operator off balance. My heart pounded as I tried to reconcile instinct, observation, and mechanical feedback, realizing the magnitude of forces I could not see. The isolation of the rig made the situation even more acute. The fog rolling in from the open ocean distorted distances, making swells appear smaller or larger than reality, and shadows danced across the load and platform in irregular, unpredictable patterns. I had to adjust constantly, every micro-correction, a dialogue with the unseen, the unpredictable currents testing both my skill and endurance. Instruments remained steadfast, oblivious to the subtle shifts beneath the rig, leaving my eyes and instincts as the only reliable indicators. Every sway, every pulse, every creak of steel reminded me of Rule 10, and the psychological strain of anticipating the unpredictable began to wear at the edges of my focus. Hours passed in relentless vigilance, and the deep revealed its will slowly, through tiny insidious movements in the water and rig. Even as I focused on maintaining stability, the shadows beneath the load twisted unnaturally, distorted by the waves and the faint glow of the rig's lights, suggesting the ocean had a consciousness beyond human comprehension. I found myself muttering instructions to the empty cab, naming micro-adjustments, as though vocalizing my awareness could somehow impose order on chaos. The unpredictability of the environment pressed on my chest, each breath weighted with tension, every heartbeat echoing in time with the sway of the rig and load. Rule 10 had become a lifeline, a psychological tether to reality, forcing me to anticipate change before it struck. The storm intensified subtly, not in obvious waves or wind, but in the hidden undercurrents that twisted the rig's legs and tugged at the suspended load. Every adjustment I made was met with unpredictable feedback, as if the deep were testing my judgment, demanding absolute vigilance and respect. Shadows on the water appeared to shift independently, creating fleeting, disturbing shapes that dissolved almost instantly, leaving uncertainty in their wake. I whispered Rule 10 to myself, a reminder that the environment was alive, reactive, and unpredictable. My body tensed with every sway, every pulse in the crane, and I realized that survival required anticipating the unseen, respecting the ocean's hidden power and never assuming calm equaled safety. Time became a blur as I navigated the invisible forces, fatigue pressing against every nerve and muscle. The rig groaned with the subtle, almost imperceptible stresses of the deep, and the load responded to forces that instruments could neither measure nor predict. The shadows of cables, cranes, and platform legs became an ever-changing tapestry, warped by unseen currents, forcing me to remain hyper-aware at all times. Every micro-shift, every pulse, demanded response, and I relied entirely on sight, touch, and instinct to maintain control. The psychological weight of Rule 10 pressed in, reminding me that even the most stable environment could transform into chaos in the blink of an eye, and that vigilance was the only safeguard against catastrophe. By the end of the shift, the ocean appeared calm again, smooth and reflective, but the memory of its hidden currents remained vivid. I had navigated the load through unpredictable forces without incident, yet the lesson of Rule 10 was indelibly etched into my consciousness. The shadows outside no longer seemed threatening, but the awareness of the deep's unseen power lingered, a permanent reminder that the environment could shift in an instant, and that assumption and complacency were deadly. My body ached from tension, eyes strained from constant vigilance, and yet I understood that compliance with Rule 10 had kept disaster at bay. The lesson was clear: the deep is never predictable, and survival demands respect, attention, and unwavering focus at all times. I first understood the full terror of Rule 11. Always respect the unknown. Some forces beneath the rig are beyond comprehension, and survival depends on acknowledgement, not confrontation. On a night when the sea was unnaturally still, an oppressive black expanse that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions, I had faced storms, equipment failures, and unpredictable currents, but this silence was different, loaded with unseen weight that pressed down through the rig and into my bones. The load above me swayed gently, almost lazily, yet I could feel an unseen tension beneath, a subtle resistance that no instrument or gauge could measure. I whispered to myself, hesitant and trembling, repeating Rule 11, trying to convince my own mind to respect the invisible forces below rather than challenge them. Shadows stretched across the water, blending with the rig's silhouette, forming shapes that felt almost conscious, observing, waiting for a misstep. The first real sign that the unknown was testing me came as a barely perceptible tug on the crane's cables, a sensation that felt alive, deliberate, as though the ocean itself had extended a finger to probe my attention. I froze, holding my breath, listening to the faint vibrations transmitted through steel and cable. Every instinct told me that this was not mechanical, not predictable, and certainly not something to ignore. I adjusted slightly, carefully, yet every micro-movement seemed to provoke another response, subtle but undeniable, reminding me that Rule 11 demanded acknowledgement, not confrontation. The calm of the water outside was deceptive. Beneath it, I sensed forces that existed on a level beyond calculation, beyond instinct, and the full gravity of respect weighed heavily on me. Minutes stretched into hours, each second magnifying the isolation and the power of the unknown. Shadows beneath the rig twisted unnaturally, reflections of the crane and load warped in ways that instruments could never interpret. My eyes darted constantly, following movements too subtle to quantify, listening to vibrations in the steel that felt more sentient than structural. Even the cables pulsed with an almost rhythmic insistence, a language I could barely comprehend. I whispered Rule 11 to myself repeatedly, grounding my mind in acknowledgement, not defiance. The ocean beneath seemed patient, indifferent, yet aware, waiting for the smallest lapse of caution or arrogance to turn disaster into inevitability. The weight of isolation pressed harder with every passing moment. I had never felt so completely alone, yet simultaneously under observation by something that defied logic, lurking beneath the calm. Every minor sway, every imperceptible tug of the load, became a conversation I could only interpret through intuition and cautious action. Instruments were useless here. Gauges, Cameras and alarms could not detect or predict the subtle, almost intelligent nudges of the deep. I understood, with chilling clarity, that survival depended not on control but on reverence, on acknowledging forces beyond my comprehension, letting the ocean's hidden power dictate boundaries. Rule 11 was the final anchor, a psychological and practical reminder that some elements of this world cannot, and should not, be challenged. Hours bled into one another, fatigue gnawing at my awareness, making shadows longer, reflections stranger, movements less predictable. The weight of the crane pulsed almost deliberately in my hands. Micro-adjustments required constant attention to avoid provoking the unknown beneath. I realized that every previous rule, attention to loads, verification, visual contact, vigilance against currents and mechanical faults, had all led to this moment, recognition that some forces exist beyond understanding. I whispered apologies under my breath to the invisible, as if acknowledging its presence could ensure safe passage through an environment that had no sympathy for arrogance. The calm around the rig felt heavy, almost oppressive, as though the ocean itself was silently testing my resolve. As the night deepened, subtle disturbances in the water and air around the rig amplified. The shadows of cables and machinery stretched and warped unnaturally, interacting with reflections to create fleeting images that vanished as quickly as they appeared. My mind, already fatigued, strained to interpret signals I could not fully understand. Every pulse, sway, and tremor demanded acknowledgement, not reaction. I realized that confrontation, any attempt to force the environment into compliance, would have been catastrophic. Instead, I adjusted, moved slowly, and observed, letting the invisible currents and pressures dictate terms. Rule 11 anchored my thought process, a constant reminder that the unknown beneath was not to be controlled but respected. The psychological strain was relentless. Shadows and reflections appeared to take forms, almost sentient, twisting around the crane, the load, and the rig legs. I felt a strange weight in my chest, a presence beyond observation, demanding caution, patience, and acknowledgement. Even the smallest hesitation or micro-mistake could provoke disaster, and I was painfully aware that survival depended entirely on alignment with forces I could neither see nor understand. Each subtle pull of the load seemed purposeful, each minor sway deliberate, reinforcing the importance of Rule 11. I spoke softly to myself, naming micro-movements and adjustments, trying to maintain control over my fear while yielding to the unseen authority of the deep. By pre-dawn, after hours of relentless focus, I had guided the load safely, following the invisible rhythms and respecting forces beyond comprehension. My muscles ached, eyes burned, yet I was alive, and the lesson of Rule 11 was etched indelibly into my consciousness. The calm of the water and the shadows outside belied the danger beneath, and I understood finally that arrogance, assumption, and defiance were mortal errors. The unknown demanded acknowledgement, subtle compliance, and a constant psychological tether to reality. Every micro-adjustment, every careful movement, had been a negotiation with forces I could not define, and compliance with the rule had preserved life. Even as the sun began to rise, illuminating the rig and stretching shadows across the water, the lessons of Rule 11 lingered. I knew that the ocean below had no intention of letting mistakes pass unnoticed, that its currents, shadows, and movements carried awareness beyond comprehension. I realized that all the previous rules, from attention to the load to vigilance against equipment faults, culminated in this understanding. Survival required respect for what cannot be controlled. The shadows and reflections outside no longer felt threatening, yet I remained aware, alert to every subtle movement and pulse. In this environment, life depended not on mastery, but on acknowledgement, humility, and attentiveness to forces beyond human understanding. I exhaled, exhausted but alert, and slowly began to secure the crane and load for the day, every movement deliberate, every micro-adjustment cautious. Even now, I could feel the invisible weight of the deep, its patient presence pressing against awareness, a reminder that Rule 11 was not merely procedural but existential. I could never let complacency take root, never assume mastery over the unknown, and never forget that acknowledgement, not confrontation, was the only safeguard between survival and disaster. Shadows of cables and machinery shifted subtly in the early light, a quiet echo of the lessons the deep had imposed on me. And then, as I paused, letting the weight of the final rule sink fully into consciousness, I felt the faintest tug at the cable, a whisper of movement that reminded me, once more, that the unknown is always present, always observing, and always demanding respect. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.